Welcome to Reveal Fears. Subscribe and like this video.
Part 1: The Vanishing. The call came on an icy December night, the kind of night that numbed fingers through gloves and made the city streets hiss with ice melt. Detective Malcolm, Mal, Drake was slouched at his desk, a stale coffee cooling beside a mountain of case files. His plan for an uneventful night unraveled when the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the station's ambient buzz. "Drake," he answered gruffly, pinching the bridge of his nose. "This is Chief Duncan. We've got a situation in Ridgewood." "A missing kid?" the voice on the other end said. Mal straightened. Missing kids weren't just another case. They were races against time. And in Ridgewood, a crumbling suburban neighborhood with more shadows than streetlights, they carried an extra weight of dread. "Details?" he asked, already grabbing his coat. 8-year-old boy. Michael Hayes. Disappeared from his bedroom tonight. No forced entry, no witnesses. His parents swear they checked on him at 8 p.m. It's like he vanished into thin air. Mal felt the familiar knot of unease coil in his stomach. Ridgewood had seen its fair share of horrors, but this sounded different. Precise. Calculated. And worst of all, silent. The Hayes family home was a modest, weather-beaten structure at the edge of a wooded lot. Snowflakes dusted the overgrown yard and clung to the skeletal branches of the surrounding trees. A lone squad car cast blue and red strobes against the house's peeling paint, the scene eerily quiet except for the crunch of Mal's boots on the icy driveway. Inside, the air was heavy with fear and the kind of raw grief that hadn't yet taken shape. Michael's parents, Laura and Tom Hayes, sat on the couch, holding each other like they were the only things keeping each other afloat. Laura's eyes were rimmed red, her hands trembling as she clutched a photograph of her son, a bright-eyed boy with an infectious grin. "We put him to bed like normal," Laura whispered. "We heard nothing. No screams. No footsteps. We went to check on him at 9, and he was gone." "Any unlocked doors? Open windows?" Mal asked, scanning the room for anything out of place. "Everything was locked," Tom said, his voice strained. "We checked the house top to bottom. He couldn't have left on his own. He was scared of the dark. He never even got up to use the bathroom at night without calling for one of us." Mal's gaze fell on the bedroom door down the hall, slightly ajar. He nodded to the uniformed officer standing nearby. "Hold them here. I'll take a look." Michael's room was a snapshot of childhood innocence, walls adorned with glow-in-the-dark stars, shelves crammed with action figures, a half-finished puzzle on the floor. The bedcovers were thrown back, as if the boy had left in a hurry, or been taken. Mal crouched, running a gloved hand over the cold hardwood floor. No scuff marks. No dirt. Nothing to suggest an intruder. But something felt off. In the corner of the room, just beneath the window, Mal spotted a small pile of dirt. He frowned, leaning closer. It wasn't just any dirt, it was black, damp, and clung together in clumps. Soil from the woods outside. The window itself was locked, the latch unbroken, and the sill undisturbed. Yet Mal couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was staring him in the face, just beyond his reach. "Drake?" A voice broke his concentration. It was the officer from the living room. "You might want to see this." In the backyard, the snow had been trampled, the tracks forming a strange, erratic pattern. They weren't footprints exactly. They were too small, too narrow, and spaced too far apart. Mal knelt, studying them. They led away from the house and into the woods, where the trees loomed like silent sentinels. "What do you make of this?" the officer asked, his breath fogging in the frigid air. Mal didn't answer. His gut told him two things: whatever had taken Michael wasn't human, and the longer they waited, the colder the trail would get. He stood, staring into the dark line of trees where the tracks disappeared. "Call in more units," he ordered. "And get me floodlights on that tree line. Whatever took this kid didn't just walk away." The hunt had begun, but Mal already felt the weight of what lay ahead. He'd seen enough in his career to know that monsters were real. And sometimes they didn't bother hiding in the dark. Part 2. Whispers in the Woods. Floodlights threw stark, shifting beams across the snow-draped trees, casting long, skeletal shadows that seemed to ripple with movement. The search party had expanded quickly, with officers combing the edge of the woods and others waiting for orders. Mal stood at the tree line, his breath visible in the cold night air, watching as the strange tracks disappeared into the underbrush. "Chief wants us to hold until daylight," one of the officers said hesitantly. "Too dangerous to press deeper in the dark." Mal shot him a look. "And what if daylight's too late? That boy's out there now. If we wait, we're searching for a body." The officer swallowed but didn't argue. Mal pressed into the woods, his flashlight cutting through the darkness like a feeble sword. The eerie quiet pressed down on him, broken only by the crunch of snow under his boots. The tracks were faint here, the disturbed snow blending with natural indentations left by animals. But they were there, too narrow, too deliberate to be made by anything he could name. 10 feet in, he found more of the dark soil scattered over the ground. He knelt, brushing his glove over it. It wasn't just wet, it smelled faintly of decay, like something unearthed from deep beneath the ground. He glanced up, sweeping his beam ahead. The light caught something hanging from a low branch. It was a small, battered shoe. The shoe belonged to Michael Hayes, the kind of detail any parent would recognize instantly. Mal held it under the beam, frowning at the ragged tears in the fabric. It hadn't been left, it had been ripped from the boy's foot. "Drake!" a voice called from behind him. Mal turned to see Officer Torres jogging through the snow, his flashlight bouncing wildly. "Found something you need to see," Torres said, his face pale beneath his hat. "It's weird." Torres led Mal about 30 yards deeper into the woods, where a clearing opened beneath a canopy of trees. The snow here was nearly pristine, untouched except for a perfect circle of that same black soil in the center. It was as if the ground had been dug up and carefully replaced. "Doesn't make sense," Torres said, his voice tight. "No tracks leading in. No tracks leading out." Mal crouched at the edge of the circle, his pulse pounding. There was something deliberate about the way the soil had been disturbed, as though someone, or something, had marked the spot for a reason. "Check this," Torres added, pointing his light at the nearest tree. Scratched into the bark was a symbol, crude but unmistakable, a series of interlocking triangles forming an angular star. Mal had seen the design before, though it took him a moment to recall where. It had been carved into the floor of a home 6 years earlier, during another missing child case. That boy had never been found. Mal's radio crackled to life. "Detective Drake, come in." He grabbed the device, his tone sharp. "Go ahead. We've got a situation back at the Hayes residence," came the reply. "Parents are reporting strange noises in the house." Mal stood, unease tightening his chest. The woods felt alive now, as if the trees were leaning closer, whispering secrets just out of earshot. "Stay here," he told Torres. "Mark everything. I'll be back." "You're leaving?" Torres asked, eyes darting nervously around the clearing. "Whatever's going on in that house might tell us more than this." Back at the Hayes residence, the atmosphere had shifted. The once frantic parents now sat huddled in silence, their eyes darting toward the ceiling. "It started about 10 minutes ago," Laura whispered when Mal entered. "A tapping sound? Like footsteps. But it's coming from inside the walls." Mal frowned. "Anyone else in the house?" "No," Tom said, his voice trembling. "Just us. We checked everywhere. The sound keeps moving." A faint thud interrupted him, this time directly above them. Laura clutched Tom's arm, her breath hitching. Mal gestured to the officers. "Search the house again. Thoroughly this time." As the officers moved room to room, Mal climbed the narrow staircase to the attic. The air grew colder with each step, and the sounds grew louder, scratching, tapping, something heavy shifting just beyond his reach. The attic door was ajar. He pushed it open, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The attic was cramped and cluttered, filled with old boxes and insulation. But at the far end, something glimmered faintly against the wooden slats. Mal stepped closer, his breath visible in the icy air. Carved into the attic floor was the same triangular symbol, its lines jagged and fresh, the wood still splintered from the effort. In the center of the symbol lay a single item. A second shoe. Mal's flashlight flickered, and the sound of scratching grew louder, now echoing from every corner of the attic. He turned, his pulse racing, but the beam caught only shadows. Something was here. Something he couldn't see. And then, as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The silence was deafening. Mal crouched over the symbol, his fingers brushing the edges of the carving. The wood was cold, almost wet, and the sensation sent a shiver up his spine. A faint whisper tickled his ear, barely audible. "Help me!" It was Michael's voice. Part 3. Echoes in the dark. Mal froze, his fingers hovering over the symbol etched into the attic floor. The whisper, soft and desperate, faded into the silence, but the sound of Michael's voice lingered in his head, chilling him to the bone. "Drake, you up there?" A voice called from the bottom of the stairs, snapping him out of his trance. "Yeah," he called back, standing abruptly. His flashlight swept the attic again, but nothing had changed. The shadows remained unmoving, the piles of forgotten belongings undisturbed. Whatever he had just heard, or thought he'd heard, was gone. Downstairs, Officer Torres was waiting, his expression tense. "We found something," Torres said, his voice low. "In the basement." Mal arched a brow. "What now?" Torres didn't answer, just gestured for Mal to follow. The Hayes basement was a claustrophobic space, its stone walls stained with decades of damp. The air smelled of mildew and earth, colder than the winter night outside. At the far end, near the furnace, 2 officers stood, their flashlights fixed on the floor. "Found this when we cleared out some old boxes," Torres explained. Mal stepped closer, his gaze narrowing. Carved into the concrete floor was another symbol, larger this time, its lines jagged and imperfect, as if scratched into the surface with desperate force. Black soil was scattered across the symbol, forming a fine layer like ash after a fire. "This wasn't here before?" Mal asked. Torres shook his head. "The parents said they never touched this part of the basement. Didn't even know about it." Mal knelt, brushing his gloved fingers over the soil. It crumbled beneath his touch, damp and reeking of decay. "How does this tie in with the woods?" Torres asked, his voice breaking the uneasy silence. Mal didn't answer immediately. His mind raced with connections, the missing shoe, the symbols, the whisper. He had seen this pattern before, too many times to dismiss it as coincidence. "This isn't random," he finally said, rising. "Whatever we're dealing with, it's methodical. Ritualistic." Torres frowned. "Ritualistic? You think this is some kind of cult?" Mal hesitated. "Maybe. Or something worse." The search of the house yielded no further clues, and by the time Mal left the Hayes residence, dawn was creeping over the horizon. The pale light did little to chase away the unease that had settled in his chest. Back at the precinct, Mal spread out the case files on his desk. Each one bore a chilling resemblance to Michael Hayes' disappearance. A 7-year-old girl taken from her bedroom in 1998. A 10-year-old boy who vanished on his way home from school in 2004. An 8-year-old girl snatched from a backyard swing set in 2015. Each case had one thing in common: the strange symbols scratched into walls, floors, or trees near the scene. None of the children had ever been found. Mal's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was the lab. In the fluorescent-lit lab, the forensic technician handed Mal a file. "Got your results on that soil you found in the basement," she said. Mal opened the file, scanning the report. His brow furrowed. "This isn't ordinary dirt," the tech explained, leaning against the counter. "It's old. Prehistoric, almost. High levels of organic decay, but no traces of modern pollutants. You wouldn't find this above ground. This stuff was buried deep, maybe 50, 60 feet down. Someone had to dig it up and bring it here." "Why?" Mal muttered to himself. The tech shrugged. That's your department, detective. I just tell you what it is. Mal returned to his desk, his thoughts spiraling. The soil, the symbols, the eerie voice in the attic, it all pointed to something far older and darker than he had anticipated. He pulled out his notebook, flipping to a page filled with rough sketches and notes from years ago. He found what he was looking for, the same interlocking triangles. Beside it, he had scrawled a single word, threshold. A shiver ran down his spine as the memory came flooding back. 6 years earlier, during the investigation of another missing child, an old folklore expert had been brought in to consult. The man had spoken of thresholds, ancient places where the barrier between worlds was thin. Symbols like this, the man had said, tapping the page, are meant to anchor the barrier. But if they're placed incorrectly, or deliberately altered, they can do the opposite. They can open it. Mal stared at the symbol on the page, his pulse quickening. What if the symbols weren't just marks? What if they were invitations? His phone buzzed again, breaking his thoughts. This time it was Chief Duncan. We've got another problem, Duncan said. A couple of kids from Ridgewood just came in, claiming they saw Michael Hayes. In the woods. 15 minutes later, Mal was sitting across from two pale, trembling boys in the interrogation room. They couldn't have been more than 12, their faces flushed with cold and fear. We were out there last night, one of them stammered. In the woods behind Michael's house. We weren't supposed to be, but we saw him. Saw who? Mal pressed. Michael, the boy said, his voice cracking. He was just standing there. By the trees. Did he say anything? Did he move? The boy shook his head violently. No. He just looked at us. But, he glanced at his friend, who nodded reluctantly. But what? There was someone else. The boy whispered. Behind him. A shadow. It didn't look right. Like it wasn't human. Mal's stomach sank. What did it do? He asked, his voice barely steady. It smiled, the boy said, tears brimming in his eyes. And then they both disappeared. Mal leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. The shadow. The whisper. The symbols. Whatever had taken Michael Hayes wasn't done yet. And if Mal didn't act fast, it wouldn't stop with him. Part 4. Into the Hollow. The two boys left the station in the care of their parents, still pale and trembling, their wide eyes haunted by what they'd seen. Mal stood at the window of the observation room, watching them go, his jaw clenched. The shadow. It smiled. The words echoed in his mind, sending shivers through him despite the station's warmth. He turned back to his desk, where the case files from Ridgewood's dark history lay spread out like puzzle pieces. This was no ordinary abduction. He was chasing something ancient, something that thrived in the dark places people were too afraid to look. By the time Mal reached the woods again, the sky was a washed-out gray, the remnants of dawn fading into overcast daylight. The snow from the night before had started to melt, leaving patches of black earth exposed. Torres was waiting for him at the tree line, his face drawn with exhaustion. Got your call, Torres said. What's the plan? We're not waiting for nightfall this time. Mal replied, shouldering a flashlight and a pack filled with supplies. We're following those tracks, no matter where they lead. Torres hesitated. You're sure about this? Whatever took that kid. He trailed off, his words heavy with unspoken fear. Mal's jaw tightened. If we don't go now, there won't be a kid to find. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less threatening but no less strange. The air was unnaturally cold, and the trees seemed to press closer together as Mal and Torres trudged deeper into the woods, following the faint trail of tracks. The black soil appeared more frequently now, scattered in small, deliberate patches as if marking a path. Mal knelt by one of the patches, running his fingers through the dirt. This wasn't just dug up, he said. It was placed here. Someone, or something, wants us to follow. Torres shifted uneasily, his hand resting on the butt of his sidearm. Feels like a trap. Probably is. Mal admitted, standing. But we don't have a choice. The tracks led them to a clearing, smaller than the one they'd found the night before but just as unsettling. At its center stood an old well, its stones weathered and slick with moss. Mal felt his pulse quicken. The well wasn't on any maps he'd studied, and judging by the overgrowth around it, it hadn't been used in decades. Another symbol, Torres said, pointing to the stones near the base. Mal crouched, tracing the familiar triangular pattern etched into the moss-covered rock. This one was older, its lines faded and worn, but the message was the same: threshold. Think he's down there? Torres asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mal stared into the well. The darkness inside was absolute, swallowing the daylight whole. There's only one way to find out, Mal said, pulling a rope from his pack. You're not seriously going down there, Torres said, his eyes widening. Stay up here, Mal ordered. If anything happens, pull me up. Fast. The descent was slow and deliberate. Mal's flashlight cut through the blackness, illuminating the rough stone walls that closed in around him. The air grew colder the deeper he went, the smell of damp earth mingling with something acrid metallic. About 20 feet down, the rope slackened as his feet touched solid ground. He swung the flashlight in a slow arc, revealing a narrow tunnel branching off from the base of the well. Drake? Torres' voice echoed faintly from above. I'm in, Mal called back. There's a tunnel. You sure about this? Not even a little. The tunnel was barely wide enough to walk through, its walls slick with moisture. The black soil was thick here, clinging to Mal's boots as he moved deeper into the darkness. The flashlight caught something ahead, scratches on the wall, similar to the symbols but more erratic, frenzied. Mal ran his fingers over them, feeling the grooves in the stone. Someone had been here recently. A faint sound reached his ears, so soft he almost missed it. A whisper carried on the still air. Help me. Mal's grip on the flashlight tightened. Michael? He called, his voice echoing down the tunnel. The whisper came again, louder this time. Help me, please. He moved faster, his pulse pounding in his ears. The tunnel opened into a small chamber, and what he saw stopped him cold. In the center of the chamber was Michael Hayes. The boy sat on the ground, his knees drawn to his chest, his face pale and streaked with dirt. He looked up as Mal entered, his wide, tear-filled eyes locking onto the detective. Michael, Mal breathed, stepping closer. It's okay. I'm here to take you home. The boy didn't move. He just stared, trembling. Michael, Mal repeated, kneeling in front of him. Are you hurt? Can you walk? The boy's lips parted, but the voice that came out wasn't his own. It was low, guttural, and filled with malice. You shouldn't have come here. Before Mal could react, the shadows in the chamber shifted, coalescing into something massive and unnatural. Eyes glinted in the dark, too many eyes. And then it smiled. Mal stumbled back, his flashlight flickering as the thing moved toward him. Its shape was impossible to define, a writhing mass of darkness that filled the chamber with a suffocating presence. Michael! He shouted, his voice cracking. But the boy was gone. In his place was a pool of the black soil, bubbling and writhing like something alive. The thing lunged, and Mal barely managed to throw himself back into the tunnel. He ran, the flashlight swinging wildly, the sound of the creature's pursuit filling the air. Torres! Mal screamed as he reached the well. Pull me up! Now! The rope jerked, and Mal clung to it as Torres hauled him out with frantic speed. The sound of the creature's growls grew fainter as he climbed, but the chill of its presence lingered. As he emerged into the clearing, gasping for air, Torres pulled him the rest of the way out. What the hell happened down there? Torres demanded. Mal didn't answer. He lay on the ground, staring up at the overcast sky, his chest heaving. Whatever had taken Michael Hayes wasn't human. And it wasn't finished. Part 5. The Smiling Shadow. Mal leaned against the cold stones of the well, his breath fogging the air. The edges of his vision still danced with the memory of that thing, the writhing mass of shadows, the unnatural eyes, and its grotesque, knowing smile. Torres crouched beside him, gripping his shoulder. Drake, talk to me. What happened? Mal shook his head, swallowing hard. It's not what I thought. Torres frowned. What the hell does that mean? It's not human. Mal rasped, his voice barely audible. Whatever took Michael, it's not human. Back at the precinct, Mal sat alone in the interrogation room, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in front of him. He couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes on him, even now. The thing in the well hadn't just seen him, it had recognized him. The door creaked open, and Chief Duncan stepped in, his face a mask of concern. Drake, you look like hell. Feels worse. Mal muttered, running a hand through his hair. Duncan pulled out a chair and sat across from him. You've got the whole department on edge, and Torres won't stop talking about what you saw out there. Says it wasn't normal. It wasn't, Mal said flatly. This case, it's not just a kidnapping. It's something bigger. Bigger how? Mal hesitated, his fingers tapping against the table. You ever hear of thresholds? Duncan raised an eyebrow. Thresholds? Like folklore? More than folklore, Mal said. Places where the barrier between worlds is thin. The symbols we've been finding, they're part of that. They're openings. Whoever, or whatever, is behind this, they're not just taking kids. They're using them to open something. Duncan stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back, letting out a heavy sigh. Mal, I don't know if I can put this in a report. Don't, Mal said. Just let me figure it out. Mal spent the rest of the day poring over every scrap of information he could find, pulling threads from the other unsolved cases that haunted Ridgewood's history. The symbols. The soil. The whispers. Each detail painted a picture of something ancient and deliberate, a ritual repeated over decades. But for what purpose? As night fell, his phone buzzed. It was Torres. You need to get back to the Hayes house, Torres said, his voice tight. What's going on? The parents, Torres said. They're saying they saw Michael. Inside the house. Mal arrived to find the Hayes family huddled on the front porch, their faces pale and drawn. Laura clutched a blanket around her shoulders, her hands trembling. He was in his room, she whispered. Standing by the bed. Just staring at us. You're sure it was him? Mal asked. Laura nodded, tears streaming down her face. It was him. But his eyes, they weren't right. They were black. Empty. Mal's stomach twisted. Where is he now? Tom pointed toward the house. He went back inside. He just walked away, like he was waiting for us to follow. Inside, the house was silent. Mal's flashlight carved narrow paths through the darkness as he moved from room to room, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. The air was heavy, thick with the same unnatural chill he'd felt in the woods. As he climbed the stairs, the floorboards creaked beneath him, each step feeling like a test of his nerve. Michael's room was at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. Mal pushed it open, his flashlight sweeping over the bed, the shelves, the walls. Empty. But then he saw it, the black soil, scattered in a perfect circle on the floor. And in the center of the circle stood Michael. The boy's face was pale, his skin almost translucent in the dim light. His eyes were pools of darkness, reflecting nothing. Michael, Mal said softly, stepping closer. It's me. Detective Drake. I'm here to help. The boy didn't respond. He simply stood there, staring at Mal with that same eerie stillness. As Mal took another step, Michael's lips parted, and a voice that wasn't his own spilled out, low, guttural, and filled with malice. You shouldn't have come back. Mal froze. Michael? Who's doing this to you? Who's controlling you? The boy's head tilted unnaturally, his mouth curling into a smile far too wide for his small face. We are always here, the voice growled. We were always here. The shadows in the room began to shift, coalescing into something darker, something alive. Mal backed away, his flashlight flickering. What do you want? The boy's smile widened. To open the door. Before Mal could respond, the shadows surged forward, enveloping the room in darkness. He stumbled back, the flashlight falling from his hand and clattering to the floor. The last thing he saw before the light went out was Michael's face, smiling as the blackness consumed him. And then came the voice, echoing from all directions, cold and final. They all float here. Part 6, The Doorway. The darkness pressed in like a living thing, heavy and cold, swallowing Mal's breath as quickly as it stole the light. His hand fumbled for the flashlight, but the oppressive black made it feel like he was groping through water, his movements sluggish and uncertain. Then came the whispers, soft, fragmented, and impossibly close. Help me! You shouldn't have come! They float! Mal froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound wasn't coming from any one direction. It was all around him, like the house itself was speaking. A sudden flare of light cut through the void. His flashlight flickered weakly on the floor, casting pale illumination over the room. Michael was gone. The circle of black soil remained, but now the symbols etched into the floor pulsed faintly, glowing like embers in a dying fire. Mal took a cautious step forward, his instincts screaming to run but his duty keeping him rooted. The symbols weren't just markings, they were active, alive, vibrating with an energy that hummed in his bones. He crouched, brushing his fingers over the edges of the glowing lines. The air around the circle felt charged, like the static before a lightning strike. And then he heard it, a low, rhythmic thrum, like the sound of distant machinery. Mal bolted from the room, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he raced down the stairs. He barely registered Torres shouting his name from the front door before bursting into the living room. What's going on? Torres demanded, grabbing Mal's arm. The boy's gone, Mal said, his voice sharp and breathless. But it's not over. There's something here. Torres' brow furrowed. What do you mean here? I mean this house, Mal snapped. The symbols, the soil, this isn't just about Michael. It's a doorway. Something's trying to come through. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the house. Mal and Torres both turned toward the source, the basement door. It was ajar now, swinging slightly on its hinges. That was locked, Torres whispered, his hand moving to his gun. Mal didn't reply. He stepped forward, flashlight aimed at the dark stairwell. The rhythmic thrum he'd heard upstairs was louder now, reverberating up from the basement. I'll go first, Mal said, gesturing for Torres to follow. The basement was colder than before, the damp air stinging their lungs as they descended. The flashlight beam swept over the stone walls and exposed pipes, finally landing on the floor in the far corner. The soil circle was still there, but now the glowing symbols had spread, crawling up the walls like vines. The light they cast painted the basement in eerie, shifting patterns. In the center of the circle stood a figure. It wasn't Michael. The thing in the circle was tall and thin, its body unnaturally elongated. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its face was featureless save for a mouth, a wide, lipless grin that stretched impossibly far. Torres swore under his breath, his gun shaking in his hands. Don't, Mal hissed. Don't shoot. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its grin fixed and unblinking, its head tilting slightly as if curious. What the hell is that? Torres whispered. The thing that's been taking the kids, Mal said, his voice trembling. The figure's grin widened, if that was even possible, and its head tilted farther, almost parallel to its shoulders. You cannot stop this, it said, its voice a grotesque amalgamation of tones, high and low, layered like a chorus. The door is open. Mal took a step forward, keeping the flashlight trained on the figure. Why are you doing this? What do you want? The figure let out a low, guttural laugh, its entire body quivering with the sound. What we've always wanted, it said. To feed. The air in the basement seemed to shift, growing heavier, thicker. Mal struggled to breathe as the symbols on the walls glowed brighter, their light intensifying to a blinding white. The figure began to dissolve, its body breaking apart like smoke caught in a windless room. But its grin remained, hovering in the air like an afterimage. "Run," it whispered. Mal grabbed Torres' arm, dragging him toward the stairs. The sound of the rhythmic thrum grew deafening, the very walls of the house vibrating with the force of it. As they reached the top of the stairs, a deafening crack split the air, followed by a rush of wind that sent them both sprawling. Mal turned, his flashlight casting a feeble glow back into the basement. The soil circle was gone. In its place was a gaping void, a swirling mass of black and red that pulsed like a living wound. And from its depths came a single hand, small, pale, and unmistakably human. "Michael!" Mal shouted, scrambling to his feet. But before. Part 7. The Reach. Mal lunged toward the basement, the swirling void's pulsing light reflecting in his wide eyes. He grabbed the railing, preparing to descend, but Torres grabbed his arm, his grip firm and unyielding. "Drake, don't!" Torres shouted. "I saw him," Mal bellowed, yanking his arm free. "He's there. I'm not leaving him." Torres' eyes darted between Mal and the writhing void below. "That thing, it's not natural. You go in there, you don't come back." "That's not an option," Mal snapped. "Stay here if you're scared." "But I'm not letting that boy die." He barreled down the steps, the thrum of the void growing louder with every step. The hand, small, pale, and undeniably Michael's, was still visible, grasping at the edge of the portal as if trying to claw its way free. "Michael!" Mal shouted, dropping to his knees at the edge of the swirling mass. The boy's fingers twitched, weak and desperate, his knuckles widening as he clung to the boundary. The portal's energy washed over Mal in waves, cold and unnatural, like a storm's fury contained within a single point. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Michael's. "I've got you, kid," Mal muttered through gritted teeth. "Hold on." The moment their hands touched, a shock jolted through Mal's body. His vision blurred, the world around him twisting into something alien and incomprehensible. He wasn't in the basement anymore, not entirely. The space was endless, a churning void of black and red streaked with flashes of blinding white. Shadows darted at the edges of his vision, their shapes fluid and ever-changing. The rhythmic thrum was here, too, deeper and more resonant, like the heartbeat of a colossal, unseen entity. And then he saw them. The children. They floated in the void, their bodies limp and pale, their eyes open but lifeless. Michael was among them, his small frame suspended in the swirling chaos. "Michael!" Mal called, his voice barely audible over the void's deafening hum. The boy's head turned, his dark eyes meeting Mal's. "Help me," Michael whispered, his voice faint and broken. Mal tightened his grip on the boy's hand, pulling with all his strength. But the void resisted, its energy dragging Michael deeper, as if the portal itself was alive and unwilling to let go. "You're not taking him," Mal growled, planting his feet against the edge of the circle. His muscles burned with the effort, his teeth clenched so tightly it felt like they'd crack. The shadows in the void shifted, coalescing into a familiar shape. The figure, the grinning entity, emerged from the chaos, its elongated body stretching toward Mal. Its mouth twisted into an impossibly wide smile as it spoke. "You can save him," it said, its voice a mocking chorus. "But there is a price." Mal ignored the creature, focusing instead on Michael's terrified face. "I won't let go," he muttered. "Not until you're safe." The figure tilted its head, its grin unwavering. "You're already too late. The door is open. The children are ours." "Like hell they are," Mal snarled. With one final pull, he yanked Michael free of the void. The boy collapsed against him, his small body trembling violently. Mal cradled him close, his flashlight casting weak shadows across the room. The void roared in fury, the swirling mass convulsing as if in pain. The figure dissolved once more, its parting words echoing through the basement. "The door is open. And you have no idea what's coming." The portal collapsed in on itself, the room falling into sudden, suffocating silence. The symbols on the walls dimmed, their glow fading into the stone as though they had never been there. Mal held Michael tighter, his pulse pounding in his ears. The boy's breathing was shallow but steady, his dark eyes now dull and unfocused. "Drake!" Torres' voice called from the top of the stairs. Mal staggered to his feet, carrying Michael up the steps. Torres grabbed his arm as they emerged into the living room, his face pale with disbelief. You actually got him," Torres stammered. "Yeah," Mal said, his voice hoarse. "But it's not over." Outside, the Hayes family rushed to meet them, Laura collapsing to her knees as Mal handed Michael over. She held him close, her sobs racking her body as Tom stood beside her, his own tears silently falling. "He's alive," Mal said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "But he's not safe. None of us are." "What do you mean?" Torres asked. Mal turned back to the house, his eyes lingering on the darkened windows. The air felt wrong, heavy and electric, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "They didn't just open a door," Mal said. "They let something in." Far in the woods, unseen by the gathered crowd, the shadows began to move. They slithered between the trees, their forms shifting and fluid, their grins wide and hungry. The door was open. And they were already here. Part 8. The Open Door. Mal stared into the dark woods, the unsettling silence a sharp contrast to the commotion around him. Officers were securing the house, the Hayes family was ushered into an ambulance, and Torres hovered close, his nervous energy palpable. "You really think it's not over?" Torres asked, his voice low. "I know it's not," Mal said, still watching the tree line. "That thing, it didn't stop me because it didn't need to. It wanted me to pull Michael out. That boy was a distraction, a tool to keep us busy while the real danger came through." Torres followed his gaze, his hand hovering near his holstered gun. "You think those things in the woods, they're what came through?" Mal nodded grimly. "And they're just the beginning." Inside the house, the basement was quiet again. The soil circle was gone, the glowing symbols erased, but the room felt wrong. Mal stepped cautiously into the space, his flashlight beam cutting through the dim light. He crouched near where the void had opened, brushing his hand across the cold concrete. It felt smooth, almost polished, as though the portal's presence had burned away any trace of imperfection. "What are you looking for?" Torres asked from the top of the stairs. "Signs of where it went," Mal replied. "If it didn't collapse completely, there might still be a trail." The trail was faint but unmistakable, a thin, dark residue that clung to the cracks in the floor, leading up the stairs and out the back door. Mal followed it into the woods, the flashlight illuminating streaks of black soil that seemed to pulse faintly in the light. Torres trailed behind, his steps hesitant. "This feels like a bad idea," he muttered. "It is," Mal agreed. "But we don't have a choice." The trail led them deeper into the forest, the air growing colder with each step. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and dance, though Mal couldn't tell if it was the wind or something far worse. Finally, they reached another clearing. At its center stood an ancient stone structure, crumbling with age but still standing tall. Symbols covered the stones, their carvings deep and precise, the same interlocking triangles Mal had seen before. "It's a ritual site," Mal said, his voice tight. Torres swore under his breath. "Why is this just sitting here? Shouldn't someone have found this by now?" "It wasn't meant to be found," Mal said. "Not by us." As they approached the structure, the air grew heavier, thick with the same electric charge Mal had felt in the basement. The black soil was piled at the base of the stones, swirling faintly as though alive. The rhythmic thrum began again, deep and resonant, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. "Drake," Torres said, his voice trembling. "Something's moving." Mal turned, his flashlight sweeping over the edge of the clearing. The shadows had grown darker, thicker, coalescing into unnatural shapes that slithered and writhed just beyond the trees. "Stay close," Mal ordered, his hand instinctively going to his sidearm. The first shadow stepped into the clearing, its form shifting and fluid, its grin wide and gleaming. "You should not be here," it said, its voice echoing like a distorted chorus. Mal leveled his gun at the creature. Too bad. What do you want? The shadow tilted its head, its grin never wavering. The door is open. Your world is ours now. Not if I close it, Mal snapped. The creature let out a low, guttural laugh. You cannot close what has been opened. The threshold is permanent. All you can do is run. Mal tightened his grip on the gun. Watch me. The shadows surged forward, their forms blending and twisting into a single, massive shape. Mal fired, the shots ringing out like thunder, but the bullets passed through the creature harmlessly, striking the trees beyond. Run! Mal shouted, grabbing Torres and pulling him toward the structure. They scrambled up the crumbling stones, the shadow mass following close behind. The structure seemed to hum with energy as they reached its peak, the symbols glowing faintly beneath their feet. Drake, what are we doing? Torres shouted. Stopping this, Mal said, scanning the symbols. There has to be a way to seal the threshold. The thrum grew louder, the air vibrating with the force of it. The shadow mass circled the structure, its grin stretching wider as it loomed closer. Mal's eyes locked onto a single symbol in the center of the stones, carved deeper than the others. It pulsed with a faint, steady glow. This is it, he muttered, dropping to his knees. This is the anchor. Torres knelt beside him. What do we do? Mal pulled his knife from his belt, the blade gleaming in the faint light. We break it. The moment the knife struck the symbol, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. The glowing lines on the stones flared bright white, the energy surging through the air like lightning. The shadow mass held, its form fracturing and writhing as the light engulfed it. It's working! Torres shouted over the deafening roar. Mal struck again, the blade digging deeper into the stone. The symbols shattered one by one, their glow fading into nothingness. The shadow mass let out one final, agonized scream before collapsing into the ground, leaving only silence in its wake. Mal and Torres sat in the clearing, the structure now dark and lifeless beneath them. The forest was still, the air heavy with the aftermath of what had just occurred. Is it over? Torres asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mal stared at the shattered stones beneath his feet, his jaw tight. For now. But deep in the woods, in the silence that followed, another shadow stirred. The door may have been weakened, but it wasn't closed. And the things that had come through weren't going back. Part 9, What Remains. The clearing was unnaturally still. The once vibrant symbols on the stone structure were now lifeless, their faint glow extinguished by Mal's blade. The rhythmic thrum that had filled the air was gone, replaced by a tense silence that felt more oppressive than the sound. Torres sat beside Mal, his face pale and drawn. That thing, he said, his voice shaky. It's gone, right? We stopped it? Mal didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the jagged edges of the broken symbols, his mind racing. He knew better than to feel relief. Maybe, he said finally, his voice flat. But the door was open too long. That thing wasn't the only one to come through. By the time they returned to the Hayes residence, dawn had begun to creep over the horizon. The pale light did little to chase away the chill in the air, and the house felt as oppressive as ever. Laura Hayes was sitting in the living room, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. Michael lay asleep on the couch beside her, his face pale but peaceful. Tom paced back and forth, his movements jerky and agitated. What's happening now? Tom demanded as Mal and Torres entered. Are we safe? Is Michael okay? Mal glanced at the boy, his chest tightening. He's alive, and that's what matters, he said carefully. But whatever took him, it's not done. Not yet. Tom's eyes widened. What do you mean, not done? You said you'd bring him back. I did, Mal said, his tone firm. But this isn't just about Michael. That thing, those things, they were trying to open something much bigger. And they still might. Laura's voice was barely a whisper. So we're not safe? Mal shook his head. No. Not yet. He stayed in the house for hours, watching Michael as the boy stirred fitfully in his sleep. The shadows in the room felt wrong, their shapes bending unnaturally in the corners. The rhythmic thrum returned faintly in the distance, almost imperceptible, but Mal felt it in his bones. Torres stepped into the room, his face lined with exhaustion. "Drake, you've been up all night. You need rest." "There's no time," Mal said, his eyes fixed on Michael. "Whatever's coming, it's already started. That portal in the basement, it was just the beginning." "Then what's the next move?" Torres asked, his voice tight. Mal looked up, his jaw set. "We find out where this ends. And we stop it." That evening, Mal returned to the precinct, combing through old records and maps. Ridgewood's history was riddled with disappearances and strange occurrences, stretching back decades, possibly even centuries. Each case followed the same pattern: strange symbols, black soil, whispers in the dark. But something new caught his eye. A map of Ridgewood, overlaid with the locations of every known disappearance. The pattern wasn't random. The locations formed a shape, a crude approximation of the same interlocking triangles carved into the ritual sites. "Damn it," Mal muttered, tracing the lines with his finger. The intersections of the symbols marked key locations: the Hayes residence, the clearing in the woods, and another spot farther west. "Another site," he whispered. The new location was an abandoned church, long forgotten by the town. Its crumbling steeple jutted into the darkening sky like a broken bone, and the surrounding cemetery was overgrown with weeds and thorn bushes. Mal and Torres approached cautiously, their flashlights slicing through the gloom. The rhythmic thrum grew louder with each step, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. "This place is worse than the last one," Torres muttered, his hand resting on his gun. "Stay sharp," Mal said. "If they're still trying to open something, this is where they'll do it." The church interior was cold and damp, the air thick with the stench of decay. The pews were overturned, and the altar was shattered, its pieces scattered across the floor. But at the center of the room was another circle of black soil, larger than the ones they'd seen before. The symbols etched into the floor glowed faintly, their lines pulsing in time with the thrum that filled the air. "They've already started," Mal said, his voice grim. A shadow moved in the corner of the room. Mal swung his flashlight toward it, the beam catching a figure hunched against the wall. It wasn't human, its body was elongated and twisted, its grin wide and gleaming. "You cannot stop this," it said, its voice a guttural growl. "The door is open." "Not for long." Mal shot back, pulling his knife from his belt. The creature lunged, its movements unnaturally fast. Mal and Torres dove out of the way, the thing's claws raking across the stone floor. Torres fired, the gunshots echoing through the church, but the bullets passed through the creature harmlessly, striking the walls behind it. "Great," Torres muttered. "That's useless. Focus on the circle," Mal shouted. "We stopped the ritual, we stopped them." He sprinted toward the soil circle, dodging as the creature lashed out again. The symbols on the floor glowed brighter, the thrum growing deafening as the air around him seemed to ripple with energy. Part 10. The Rising. Mal reached the soil circle, the pulsing light from the symbols bathing him in an eerie, flickering glow. The air felt charged, heavy with the electric hum of something ancient stirring beneath the surface. Behind him, Torres fired another futile shot at the creature, the bullets punching into the stone walls as the thing twisted and darted through the shadows. "Whatever you're doing, do it fast," Torres shouted, his voice laced with panic. Mal dropped to his knees, his knife trembling in his hand. The glowing lines of the symbols seemed alive, shifting and crawling across the floor like veins carrying something vital. "They've anchored this one deep," Mal muttered under his breath. The creature lunged again, its elongated limbs stretching impossibly far. Torres dove to the side, narrowly avoiding its claws. The thing let out a guttural hiss, its grin widening impossibly as it turned toward Mal. "Drake!" Torres shouted, scrambling to his feet. "It's coming for you." Mal didn't look up. He drove the knife into the center of the circle, the blade sinking into the stone with a sharp crack. The glow from the symbols flared, A blinding white light that sent the creature skittering back with an unnatural howl. Mal twisted the knife, the stone beneath it splintering further. The thrum in the air shifted, becoming erratic, uneven. "You will not stop this." The creature growled, its voice layered and resonant. "Watch me." Mal snarled, driving the blade deeper. The ground beneath the circle shuddered violently, the symbols fracturing and dimming. The creature let out another agonized screech, its body rippling and flickering like a dying flame. "It's working!" Torres shouted, raising his gun again despite its ineffectiveness. But as the light from the circle faded, the shadows in the room deepened, growing denser and more oppressive. The creature's voice filled the church, booming like thunder. "The door is open. You cannot undo what has begun." Mal felt the vibrations beneath him intensify, the stone floor cracking and splitting as something massive shifted below. "This isn't just a portal," Mal said, his voice tight. "It's a gate." The floor exploded. Mal and Torres were thrown back as a massive force erupted from the circle, sending shards of stone and clouds of black soil into the air. The thrum grew deafening, a constant, pulsating roar that seemed to vibrate in Mal's skull. From the fractured ground rose a column of swirling black and red energy, its surface rippling like liquid fire. Within the column, shadows writhed and stretched, their forms indistinct but undeniably alive. Mal staggered to his feet, his ears ringing. "Torres!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar. Torres was lying a few feet away, groaning as he pushed himself up. "I'm good!" he yelled back, though his face was pale with terror. The creature that had been chasing them was gone, its form consumed by the column. But the thing inside the energy was far worse. A shape began to emerge from the column, massive and monstrous. It was like the shadows that Mal had seen before, but magnified 100-fold. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, filled with jagged, gleaming teeth, and its eyes burned with a malevolent light. "This isn't happening," Torres muttered, staring up at the thing. "This can't be real." "It's real," Mal said, his voice cold. "And if we don't stop it, it's going to spread." The creature let out a roar that shook the walls of the church, its voice resonating with the same layered tones as the smaller ones. "You open the door. Now we consume." Mal turned to Torres. "We can't stop this here. Not like this." Torres shook his head. "What do you mean, not here? Where the hell do we go?" "There's another anchor," Mal said, his mind racing. "Another site. We need to cut it off at the source." The creature began to descend from the column, its massive form twisting and writhing as it pulled itself free. The energy around it pulsed violently, the red and black light painting the walls in grotesque patterns. "We don't have time," Torres shouted. "Then we make time," Mal said, grabbing Torres by the arm and dragging him toward the church's shattered doors. They stumbled into the night, the cold air biting at their skin. Behind them, the church shuddered, its stone walls cracking as the monstrous form inside continued to grow. Mal pulled out the map he had marked earlier, his hands shaking. "The last site," he said, his voice frantic. "It's east of here. Old farmland." Torres nodded, his breath coming fast. "Then let's go." As they ran toward their car, the creature's roar echoed behind them, a sound that seemed to shake the very ground they stood on. And somewhere in the distance, far beyond the town, another sound began to rise, a rhythmic thrum, steady and deliberate. The door wasn't just open. It was spreading. Part 11. The Final Circle. The car sped down the narrow country road, its tires skidding on patches of loose gravel as Mal gripped the wheel tightly. The rhythmic thrum had become a constant in the air, vibrating through the earth, growing louder with each passing mile. Torres sat beside him, gripping the door handle, his face pale. "This last site, how do you know it's the source?" Mal didn't take his eyes off the road. "The map. The patterns. It all points to this spot. If we don't stop it there, it'll spread, and we won't be able to contain it." "And then what?" Torres asked, his voice tight. "Then we all die," Mal said flatly. The farmland was long abandoned, overgrown with weeds and shadowed by skeletal trees. The house that once stood at the center of the property was little more than a crumbling ruin, its roof caved in, and its walls scorched from some long-forgotten fire. But the energy in the air was unmistakable. The rhythmic thrum was deafening here, a pulse that seemed to resonate from the very ground beneath their feet. "This is it," Mal said as he stepped out of the car. Torres followed, his gun drawn. "What's the plan?" "Destroy the anchor," Mal said, his voice grim. "And pray it's enough." They moved cautiously through the overgrown field, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The black soil appeared in scattered patches, leading them toward the center of the property. Finally they saw it. Another circle, larger than any they'd encountered before. The symbols carved into the ground glowed an intense red, their light reflecting off the twisted, jagged stones arranged around the perimeter. And in the center of the circle stood a towering structure, a monolith of dark, pulsating energy. The column of light at the church had been small compared to this. This was a gateway, fully open, and shadows poured from it like smoke, slithering across the ground with unnatural speed. Torres froze. This is it. This is what they've been building toward." Mal nodded, his jaw tight. "And it's not going to stop unless we do something." The shadows writhed and twisted, their shapes forming grotesque mockeries of human figures. They moved toward Mal and Torres, their grins wide and predatory. "We don't have time for a fight," Mal said, pulling a flare from his pack. He lit it, the bright red light momentarily pushing the shadows back. They hissed and recoiled, their forms flickering as they retreated into the edges of the circle. Mal turned to Torres. "Keep them off me. I'll handle the monolith." Torres nodded, raising his gun despite knowing it was useless. "Go. Just make it quick." Mal sprinted toward the circle, the flare casting wild shadows around him. The energy from the monolith was overwhelming, a suffocating weight that pressed down on him with every step. As he reached the base of the structure, he saw the symbols carved into its surface. They glowed with the same pulsating red light, their lines sharp and angular, radiating power. "This is it," Mal muttered, pulling his knife. The shadows surged toward him, their hissing cries piercing the air. Torres fired, his bullets striking the ground and walls around them, creating enough chaos to slow their advance. "Drake! Whatever you're doing, hurry!" Torres shouted. Mal drove the knife into the base of the monolith, the blade biting into the stone. The glow from the symbols flickered, the rhythmic thrum faltering for the first time. The monolith let out a low, guttural sound, as if in pain. Mal twisted the blade, carving through the symbols as quickly as he could. The energy around him grew unstable, the ground shaking violently beneath his feet. "Almost there," he muttered, sweat pouring down his face. The shadows screeched, their forms growing more erratic as the monolith's energy weakened. One of them lunged at Torres, knocking him to the ground. "Drake!" Torres screamed, struggling to push the creature off him. Mal turned, his eyes widening. He grabbed another flare, igniting it and throwing it toward Torres. The light exploded across the ground, driving the shadow back and giving Torres enough time to scramble to his feet. "Finish it!" Torres yelled. Mal turned back to the monolith, slashing through the final symbol with a fierce cry. The blade shattered the glowing lines, sending cracks spidering across the surface of the structure. The rhythmic thrum stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. For a moment, nothing happened. And then the monolith exploded. The force of the blast knocked Mal to the ground, his ears ringing as shards of stone and bursts of energy shot into the air. The shadows let out an ear-piercing wail, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the gateway collapsed. When the light finally faded, the circle was gone, replaced by scorched earth and silence. Mal sat up slowly, his body aching, his breath ragged. Torres stumbled toward him, his face smudged with dirt and his hands trembling. "Is it over?" Torres asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mal looked at the smoldering remains of the monolith, the air now eerily still. "I think so," he said. But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. Part 12. The echoes remain. The smoldering ruins of the monolith left an eerie scar on the farmland. The rhythmic thrum was gone, the oppressive energy dissipated, but the silence felt wrong. It wasn't the peace of victory. It was the quiet that followed a predator retreating, waiting for its moment to strike again. Mal rose unsteadily, gripping Torres' arm for balance. The two of them stood in the ashen remains of the circle, the glow of the symbols now completely extinguished. "Is it really over?" Torres asked again, his voice laced with exhaustion and doubt. "I wish I could say yes," Mal said, staring at the ground where the monolith had stood. "But something this old, this powerful, it doesn't just go away." Back at the precinct, Mal and Torres sat in the dim light of the break room, nursing cups of coffee that neither of them were drinking. The events of the last 2 days replayed in Mal's mind like a broken film reel. The symbols, the shadows, the boy's pale face as he clawed his way out of the void. Torres broke the silence. "You think we closed it? That whatever was coming through is gone for good?" Mal didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "We stopped the gate. We stopped this one. But there are others out there. I've seen the maps. There are circles like this in other places, other towns. And those doors are still open. So what now?" Mal's jaw tightened. "Now we make sure this town stays safe. And then we find the next one." That night Mal returned to the Hayes residence. The house felt quieter than before, but the lingering unease was still there, like an old wound that hadn't fully healed. Laura and Tom Hayes sat in the living room, watching Michael sleep on the couch. "He's been different since he came back," Laura said softly, her eyes fixed on her son. "Quieter. He doesn't talk, doesn't play. It's like he's not all here." "He's been through something no one should ever go through," Mal said, his tone careful. "It'll take time. But he's strong." Laura nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "Thank you for bringing him back." Mal hesitated, then said, "Keep an eye on him. If you notice anything strange, anything at all, you call me." Laura looked at him sharply. "You think it's not over?" Mal didn't answer. Instead, he knelt by Michael's side, watching the boy's chest rise and fall with shallow breaths. For a moment he thought he saw Michael's lips move. He leaned closer, his heart pounding. The boy whispered a single word, so faint it was almost lost in the quiet. "Door." Mal left the house with a weight in his chest. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets, carrying whispers he couldn't quite make out. He lit a cigarette with shaky hands, staring out at the woods in the distance. The fight wasn't over. He knew that now. The door might have been sealed, but the echoes of what came through would never truly leave. And somewhere, in another forgotten corner of the world, another door was opening. The end. For now.
Thanks for listening. Subscribe, like, and don't miss the next scary stories. Bye-bye.